Okay. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on tendering and procurement best practices. My name is Adam Brome and I'm an administrative coordinator with SARM. We're going to start off today's webinar with a brief introduction to the Adobe Connect platform. We will then transition into the main presentation followed by a Q&A session. This webinar will be recorded and a copy of the recording will be available on our website under the webinars page following today's session. To maximize your audio and video quality during today's webinar, please either join through Google Chrome or the Adobe Connect desktop app. The chat box is located right underneath, or on the right side of your webinar window, and is visible to all webinar participants and facilitators. You can use this to connect with other attendees, bring any technical difficulties to the speaker's attention for troubleshooting, or to provide any comments and/or feedback. There's a dedicated question and answer box labeled Q&A, which is located right underneath the chat box. This is where you can submit any questions that you may have regarding the webinar content throughout today's session. Please do not submit any questions through the chat box. If we run out of time before your question has been asked during the Q&A session, our presenters will follow up with you directly offline following today's webinar. There will be a copy of today's presentation available for download during the Q&A portion of the session next to the chat box. Please let me know in the chat if you are unable to download the file and I will email it to you directly. And again, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties during today's event, please notify us in the chat box and we'll do our best to troubleshoot. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Dustin Resch, SARM's Manager of Programs, who will be moderating today's session.
Hi, everyone. As Adam mentioned, my name is Dustin Resch, and I'm the Manager of Programs here at SARM. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our two speakers on tendering and procurement best practices. Our first speaker is Andrew Konopelny, who is Associate Counsel at MLT Aikins at their Regina office. Andrew practices in the area of construction and corporate law. He has a particular focus on complex commercial and construction dispute resolution. So he brings a lot of experience to the table to discuss these matters. And with him as well is Robbie McLellan. Robbie is counsel at MLT Aikins at their Regina office also. Robbie maintains a general corporate and commercial practice with a particular focus on construction and infrastructure projects. This includes advising owners and developers on all facets of the procurement process. And so without further ado, I'll pass this over to Andrew and Robbie to join us in their presentation. And when we move to the question and answer section, I'll be happy to moderate the questions that come in through the the Q&A spot on the bottom of your Adobe Connect platform. So Andrew and Robbie, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Dustin. It's good to be here today and good to present to everyone on, a topic that is very near and dear to Robbie and my hearts, because it's what we do day in, day out. So, yeah, we're here to talk about tendering and procurement best practices. I am just gonna, there's a photo of us, obviously, and Dustin's already introduced us, so I'll just keep going right into the agenda. So we thought we'd tackle things at, a couple different levels today. And so the agenda for things we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some key terms and concepts in procurement, which will cover procurement options, choosing a pricing and delivery model, and trade agreements. And then we're going to talk a little bit about key project risks and key contractual terms. And then obviously, if there's any questions arising out of that, we're happy to answer them at the end. I hope everyone can hear us, and if people, it seems like the audio is a bit choppy. Maybe, Robbie, you can chime in and see if that works on your end.
Sure, I'm getting the audio loud and clear on my end. However, if we are breaking up kind of mid-sentence and we need to repeat something, please let us know and we'll do our best to speak loud, enunciate, speak slowly, and hopefully our messages come through.
Yeah, for sure. We'll keep going and jump right into the presentation then. So, starting with kind of the key terms, and a lot of this is borne by our experience, some in the municipal sector, some in other sectors, but we tried to focus to his presentation on issues that we see coming up a lot out there in the procurement space where people seem to be running into issues. And so the biggest one that I have to say we hear a lot about is tenders and RFPs. What's the difference? Is there a difference? And kind of what the implications of the differences are. So to answer the question, the very basic question, yes, there is a difference. What we would characterize a tender as is the idea that there's a tender that goes out there. It's an offer. By responding to the bid, bidders are accepting the offer, and if they are the successful proponent, they are accepting that they will enter the final contract. So the project owner and the bidder must enter the contract. Now, in the tender process, it's a lot stricter, we'd say, than say an RFP. And so basically anything that's in the tender in terms of requirements have to be followed. And we would always say do that carefully and with legal advice if you're planning on going in a different direction or doing anything like that. I guess the key concept is in a tender is that the price that you're given is not revocable. The contractor can't come back and say, by the way, sorry, that's not actually, thanks for selecting me as the winning bidder. That's not the actual price. I forgot to tell you that it's actually 20% more. That's basically by giving that tender price, they're accepting that they will enter the contract under those terms. Now, an RFP, on the other hand, doesn't have this idea of a bid contract that by submitting the bid, they're promising to enter the final contract for that price and on those terms. And so the only contract is the one that you might agree to later. And so there's the ability to negotiate and evaluate proposals, I would say more holistically, and identify any alternative solutions. And so in a properly structured RFP, owners have more flexibility in addressing non-compliant proposals, because I'm sure you've all seen documents come through the door from contractors that don't actually comply with what the procurement documents is looking for. And sorry, I'm just seeing a good question. RFP is request for proposals. So yeah, thank you. Nomenclature kind of issues, we'll cover those just as we get to them. And so, and there's a lot of information here, but one thing I do want to say is it's not, by writing tender at the top or request for proposals at the top of the document or RFP at the top of the document, that's not determinative of what the document is going to be interpreted by a court as, and it's not determinative of what rules kind of apply to the procurement process. So I don't propose to go through all of this because we've got a lot to cover and not a lot of time, but my understanding is this will all be available after the fact. So at a high level, there's advantages and disadvantages to going either way. And so in a tender, you're locked in on price, you're getting direct competition on pricing. Really good when you have a very defined scope of what you want. You basically have the scope all ready to go of what the project is going to look like and what you want it to look like, and you just go out to the market and say, how much is this going to cost? Not so good if you want to talk to the contractor and figure out, are there efficiencies here that we can realize, or are there, are we missing something, or things like that of that nature. A tender doesn't allow you to go and negotiate after the fact. Basically, what you get is kind of what you have to deal with. The other issue is that tenders are subject to what we would call the law of competitive bidding. And without diving too much into that, what it means is that if you don't follow the procurement process that you've laid out, and you pick someone who should not have been picked under the process that was laid out. So say the best price bid was non-compliant for whatever reason. They didn't submit something that they were required to submit. Say, if they were required to submit CVs of the people who were going to do the project and they just didn't submit the CVs, unless there was something otherwise in your tender document allowing you to kind of waive that non-compliance, you would have to disqualify them, even though they're the lowest price. And the consequence of not disqualifying them is that the second place bidder could launch a legal challenge, basically for their lost profits on the job, to get compensation for their lost profits from you not choosing them. So, we all know that contractors have margins. So you're going to pay one contractor to actually do the work and pay their margin, and then you can be sued for the person who's not doing the work for you, can sue you for their margin too. And so, the reality is it's just not a good situation to be in. And, we've seen people get into it before, and it's expensive to fight from a legal perspective, and there becomes uncertainty. And so it's kind of a long, protracted process. And, for us, we deal with these kind of things every day, but for most people listening, I'm sure that sounds, awful and terrible and distracts from actually getting the things you want done, which is, getting projects built and, kind of paying for them and kind of moving to the next one.
And
you know what? Yeah, I was going to throw it to you, Robbie. Is there anything kind of that you have thoughts on here?
Yeah, so I think you nailed it. In the real world, we use the terms tender and RFP interchangeably. So it really doesn't matter what we're calling it, as much as we understand that there's two methodologies in your procurement strategy. There's a binding process, which has very strict rules associated with it. And it's the binding process that within this presentation we're referring to as a tender. It basically has this notion of irrevocability and the necessity for contractors to provide what they're presenting within their proposal. And then we have a non-binding process that is a little bit more flexible, has a little bit more ability for the owner to clarify, negotiate, and kind of make up some more rules within their procurement strategy. Both the binding and non-binding processes are subject to the trade agreements, which Andrew is going to address a little bit later on in this presentation. And really what this is it's owner choice as to the strategy that they feel is best for them in the priorities of this project that they're developing here, and really just trying to figure out, who they think their submitting proponents are going to be, what is the best fit considering the different risks in the binding, non-binding process, and developing that kind of the front end documents, which eventually become your public documents. And so really what it is a notion that there's different ways of doing this with different risks, and that owners should really be putting their mind and putting some strategy and some thought to what processes they're going to go with. And simply, this is what we did last time, so this is what we're going to do this time, isn't always necessarily the best way of approaching these things.
Yeah, and I think that's totally right, Robbie. It totally covers the main issue that I think we see a lot is, it's very hard, if you have the conversation at the front end on what do we want to accomplish and how do we think we're best going to accomplish that in the market today, having that discussion at the front end before documents go out on the street, so to speak, is much more beneficial than, often we have people come to us after something has gone wrong, and then, our hands are tied, and it's very hard to kind of help you have a successful procurement if things are kind of already halfway down the path. The ball's rolling down the hill. It really takes a lot to try to change that once that's already happening. So I think that's kind of a big and key takeaway is think on the front end kind of what you want to accomplish with the procurement and what it might look like. And just, moving on to a couple other, terms, and not to, these are maybe less common, or I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through them, but there's kind of this idea of an RFQ. And so an RFQ is, generally not made available. And so basically you've kind of pre-selected a number of predetermined bidders, and you're kind of going out to them for pricing, which kind of leads to the next bullet, which is an RFSQ, or a pre-qualification. And so you might say, we don't, lots of project owners like to do more of a two-stage process. And there's never, with a lot of the stuff we're going to say today, there's not a right way or a wrong way to do things. There's just different ways to do them with different benefits and different risks. And so pre-qualification, maybe you want to narrow down your bid list before you get everyone to go through the work of submitting a big proposal. And so pre-qualification is a way to kind of narrow that list down and figure out who are the key people that we want to be involved in this procurement. And then there's sole sourcing, which you award it directly to someone without kind of running a competition. And there's always a risk there from a trade agreement perspective, that unless you fall within a recognized exception to the trade agreements, sole sourcing is dangerous. And so, a lot of care should be taken. I mean, I'd say a lot of care should be taken with choosing any procurement model, but particularly sole sourcing, we often see people run into problems. Now, Robbie, I'll kind of turn it over to you on, unless you have anything else on that, maybe turn it over to you to talk a little bit about pricing models.
Sure, definitely. Thank you. So for project pricing models, these are things that I think most people in attendance today are going to be somewhat familiar with, whether it's through a public procurement engagement for services within the RRM, or simply a renovation within their home. These are our three most common methods of which we call project pricing models or compensation strategies within construction services types agreements. The first is your fixed price lump sum. It can also be commonly called a design a bid build model. And really what this is there's a predefined scope of work, and whatever contractor you engage, they're basically promising to get that scope of work done for X price. And if it costs them, $1 million less than X, then good for them. If it costs them $1 million more than X, then I guess they're out $1 million. And so this is by far probably the most common form and most familiar form to most people. However, I'll note that internationally, this notion of fixed price lump sum contracts is really diminishing, especially when we're talking about very large commercial construction projects, and it really doesn't exist much anymore in the industrial sector either. And that's because owners for large projects are moving more and more to a more collaborative and less adversarial project pricing methodology, where there isn't as much tension for pricing. And so I think it's a very important bullet point to describe and emphasize here that when we talk about lump sum pricing, what's really, really important is this notion of well-defined scopes of work. And so what this needs to be, first of all, is the design, the initial design of what's going to be built needs to be very advanced to the point that it's almost nearly perfectly done in order to avoid price escalation, to avoid other types of tension and confrontation on the job. So that in itself doesn't really have much alignment for fast track projects where contractors can get going on a scope of work that is initially going to be done or is inevitably going to be done while the rest of the design development is underway. It's frankly the entirety of the project needs to be done, and then go out and get a price on that. The other thing that it doesn't really bode well for is renovation type work, or work that potentially unforeseeable or unpredicted circumstances may arise. If we think about a renovation where we're not entirely sure what's behind X wall in a building that was built in the 1930s, and we open it up and it's far different than what was expected, all of a sudden we're going to have some uncertainty into the work that the price of which they lump sum bid on is no longer reliable. And so we constantly see that tension between owner and general contractor, or general contractor and subcontractor on lump sum pricing, because it's this determination of, was whatever we are building at the end the same scope of work that we had bid on? Was it anticipated and included in the price, or is this now extra? And so we see that type of tension a lot in fixed price lump sum type projects, where what we're after is price certainty, but we can only ensure price certainty if we have scope certainty. So that's kind of our most common form, typically in Western Canada, for small scale new construction type projects. The next thing that we see is cost plus, which is exactly what it kind of sounds like, where our contractor is going to be charging us all the direct costs of which they have incurred, plus some percent markup, typically a percent markup, which they're going to all cost plus 5% or 10% or 20%, whatever the prevailing market kind of allows, especially within that competitive tendering tension that we attempt to create with our procurement strategy. The difficulties with cost plus is first of all, there isn't that guaranteed price certainty that we as owners typically like to have, and so we have difficulty managing what costs are reasonable, which costs are not reasonable, and has the contractor done a good job in mitigating and managing the spend, or are they just kind of spending at will, not really concerned because it's not their money? And frankly, the alignment of this model really is, the more money that the project spends, the more money they make because of their percent markup. The secondary kind of main issues that we see on cost plus projects is often the debate as to what is true cost, right? When we're using labor rates, do those labor rates represent cost and have appropriate burdens built in? But is there also overhead and profits built into these labor rates, or the material costs or the equipment costs? Or are we finding situations where the contractor's double dipping on those? And so it's all about ensuring that your procurement strategy leads to a fair measuring of these normalized costs for apples to apples comparison. I would say the key principle in a cost plus compensation type model is to ensure that our owners have a level of trust between the owner and contractor, and to understand that the contractor is spending the owner's money and they're going to need that permission first. The levels of budget control that come in managing that cost spend, and ensuring that there's appropriate reporting, and more than anything is transparent communication between the contractor and the owner, with reliable cash flow projections, so we know what money is going to be spent and what we're going to be getting for that money before we agree on it, and we're not just signing kind of blank checks. Our last unit rate provision here is most applicable to civil works construction, and so any of the individuals today have been involved in the highway construction, we're seeing a lot of earth moving, road building materials, concrete pours, things of this nature, and it's just simply a matter of, for every cubic meter of X poured or Y moved or whatever it is, it's going to be $1,000. And at the end of the day, you just count up all those meters squared or meters cubed and multiply it by the unit rate, and that's how much it costs. That same, I would emphasize that the same principles of cash flow projections, the same emphasis on contractor trust, and some type of reliable measuring metric and certification is probably needed for these models. I think we have a question that kind of relates before we move on. And so I'm just going to read the question. Can an RFQ be used if the item service is above the procurement thresholds? And so this is what we're talking about as an RFQ, to we're going to go out to a select number of invitees. So we're going to pick our 3 favorite local contractors and ask them for a price. And can this be done? I would say if the trade agreements require it to be a public tender, then you have to allow the open source of the bids, and you can't just kind of pick your 3 favorites, whether they be your neighbors or they've done a great job for you last time. You have to allow the public to provide pricing in compliance with the trade agreement. So
Yeah.
those would be kind of probably more used by small projects below thresholds, or in the alternative, more for private industry than public entities. Does that make sense, Andrew?
I think so. And the only thought I had on that, and I welcome your thoughts on it. I mean, the trade agreements are inherently about fairness and, open procurements. And I think, to the extent RFQs that I've ever seen them done above the trade agreements, they kind of went hand in glove with a pre-qualification process that was open.
Yeah.
So typically that's how, I would maybe see it, that, then, if the question ever comes, well, was this fair? We whittled down our list and then we asked the people on the list for the price. Has a far better chance of being considered fair than, we just called up 3 people who we thought would be good at this. That's kind of a bit of a dangerous game. So I hope that kind of answers the question, that, yeah, you would typically be doing it either under the trade agreement thresholds or, in a bit of a two-stage process above the thresholds. But even there, you would want to exercise some caution in how you're running that.
I totally agree with that, Andrew. Yeah, great assessment. So very briefly, going to spend a minute describing kind of typical nomenclature we see in the primary service provider that we are engaging under our construction services agreement. So, we may engage a general contractor, we may engage a construction manager, and we may engage a design builder. And all of these names and all of these relationships are shades of one another, with some potential just kind of slight differences. I think generally most of us understand the concept of engaging a general contractor or a contractor. And really what this engagement in this relationship is this notion that we engage this contractor and they're going to be responsible for both the supervision and execution of the work. In most circumstances, the general contractor is going to have their own employees swinging hammers, drilling screws and things of this nature, and actually self-performing portions of the work, as well as potentially subcontracting as needed. In any event, they're going to be responsible for the budget, the workmanship, the schedule, and the overall quality of the work here. And so this is kind of the normal course. Now, general contractors, we sometimes kind of use synonymous with lump sum contracting, but that's not always the case. We can use general contractors for lump sum. We can use general contractors for cost plus engagements, unit rate contracts. And I didn't mention on the last slide, but you can do a blend. You can do a blended version where some scopes of work within a big project are lump sum, some projects or some scopes of work within a project are cost plus, and other parts are unit rate. You can mix and match these different compensation models all within the same contract, all within the same project. And so, general contractors, kind of the broad term of, they're going to have the execution and supervision risk. Construction management is a little bit different entity and a little bit different animal. And really, it gets very much blended in the world of the CCDC 5B, construction manager at risk, which is a contract that many of us may be familiar with. And in that case, I would say in that case, and in the case of a standard construction management, kind of typical construction management methodologies, they're kind of providing the white collar version of construction. And really what they're talking about is project management, some procurement help, some budget management, and some supervision. But construction management in itself isn't really about the actual execution of the work. And so really what we're talking about is the construction manager typically doesn't provide carpenters and laborers. They're not swinging hammers in the traditional sense. And this is where we're starting to see the blurring the lines of the construction manager and general contractor, where nowadays under that CCDC 5B contract, we're seeing many of the construction managers self-performing some scopes of work, whether it be work that'd be traditionally done by a sub-trade in a competitive tendering environment, or just doing what we call CM support work, where they're providing general laboring, general carpentry to kind of fill the gaps between traditional scopes of work. And so one of the biggest differences that we see between construction management and general contractor is typically construction management is engaged earlier on in the process. They're going to help with the development of the design. They're going to help with the development of the budget and these types of things, different than a general contractor where typically the scope of work is already defined and then they're bidding on that perfectly defined scope of work. The last is design builder, and this is a totally different methodology of construction where we're taking the one throat to choke model, and you're having one person that's responsible for both the design and the construction of the project. Different than general contractor and construction management, where the owner is independently engaging a designer architect to help develop and design the project that the contractor, the construction manager are going to be building. In this case, the contractor is also responsible for the design. There's some collaboration between owner and design builder to get the project to the final design that the owner wants. However, it's more about the owner kind of telling the public, the potential proponents, design builder proponents, to basically say, hey, we need a building that is X stories, X square feet. It's going to serve this purpose. It has to, be, within this budget, and it has to be, wood frame or concrete frame. It has to have this energy consumption and this water consumption. And it kind of lays out the requirements of the building, and then the design builder kind of is responsible for overall designing it. So a little bit different relationships that we see between our service engagements with the owner, but they're all kind of shades of one another.
Yeah, and sorry, just to
Go ahead,
jump in there,
Yep.
you use the one throat to choke kind of I don't know, metaphor, and it's kind of true because I've done a lot on the dispute side when projects kind of don't go to plan, and it's always finger pointing, and so generally the project owner says, well, I didn't get what I wanted, or it was massively over time or over budget, or is bad, quality is bad. And then usually you've got in a general contractor model or a construction management model, you've got, your designer in one contract, and you've got your contractor in the person who built it in a different contract, and they're both pointing at each other and at you. So, I mean, like we said before, no right answers, but just, different risks and different outcomes based on, the specifics of a certain job. So, to quickly cover trade agreements, and trade agreements could be, almost entirely their own topic. So I don't, we're maybe giving them a bit of short shrift here, but can't talk about procurement without mentioning them. And so the idea is that, there's trade agreements. The aim of them is to reduce, barriers to trade between, different governments and, the people who work in those different provinces and countries. And, they're based on openness, non-discrimination, fair processes and transparency. And kind of the current kind of model is to create some protest mechanisms inside those agreements for unsuccessful bidders to use against public bodies like rural municipalities. And in some sense they're not used very often. There's not many bid protests under, for example, the new West Trade Partnership Agreement. which applies, across Western Canada. I think there's less than 5 that have gone to a decision in, several years here now. And I think part of it is because, that there's a cap on the amount of money that a bidder can get, which is $50,000. So, not a ton of money. And, but I think, for most RMs out there, it's you don't want a bid protest. One, because you have to, probably pay some lawyers to defend against it, which is not, cheap by any stretch of the imagination. You're out in the public as, someone saying you ran an unfair procurement process, which is, bad for reputation. So there's, $50,000, on a small procurement is a bit of a hit, but on a big procurement, in the millions of dollars is, in the overall project budget, relatively small. But it's, we see people not wanting it to happen for reasons beyond money. And so that's, as toothless as it may be, it's still important to comply. And, there's 2 main trade agreements that municipal governments should be aware of. One is the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which is the federal government and all the provinces. The other is the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, which, as I said, is kind of Western Canada. And so there's thresholds where the trade agreements don't apply, as someone referred to in one of the questions. So these are the current thresholds. And I think the Canadian Free Trade Agreement ones have a bit of an inflationary aspect to them. But, generally this would be for kind of smaller projects, that you might be doing several of these a year, not, your big ticket items that you're, doing, maybe, a key project in your community. And, without getting into the weeds of all the details here, this could be a whole nother presentation entirely, but there are exceptions, of course, where it doesn't apply. And so, for example, ensuring compatibility with specialized goods. So you've bought something that's like a proprietary technology. Already you've bought it, and you need to service that proprietary technology. Well, that might be a situation where there's only actually one person who can come and do the work, without voiding all your warranties and just having a handyman who's never seen this machine before kind of tinkering with it isn't a good idea. And then there's unforeseen urgency, warranty work, which I kind of just mentioned. So there are exceptions. They're pretty narrow, and so but it's important to know them, because there are situations where trade agreements won't apply, even if you're above the thresholds. But again, exercising caution is kind of the name of the game, that I like to say with trade agreements. And I guess now we're going to kind of turn into kind of key risks. So kind of got the background here. So what are kind of the key risks that we see coming up time and time again? And so I'll turn this over to Robbie to hit some of them, and then we'll talk a little bit about what you can do in your contracts.
Fantastic, thanks. I do note that there's a couple questions, and maybe what we'll do is answer these questions kind of at the end, just so we have enough time to get through the presentation first. So we appreciate your question submissions, and we'll get to them. So really, as Andrew was saying, the next few slides are going to be talking about key procurement risks, which, as we kind of look at it, are considerations that owners really have to put their mind to when they are developing a procurement strategy for a project, that they're going to have to put their mind to when deciding on how to and who to award as the successful proponent, and some of the kind of consequences that may arise in the event that they don't, that they haven't thought about these things, or they kind of make a misstep. So I think the first thing, which is fairly obvious, is not following the terms of the procurement document. So whether we're talking about a binding process or a non-binding process, tender, RFP, whatever we want to call it, our document that we're going to put out on the street to solicit bids is going to have a bunch of rules in it. And these rules are going to be the rules of the game. And if we say that we as owner are going to conduct ourselves in this way, we are going to choose the successful proponent in this way, or whatever these kind of rules that we publish, and we don't follow those rules, we're inevitably going to step in it. And so what you kind of this initial kind of widespread thing and notion is here is let's think about the rules that we want to publish within that document, and then let's make sure that we follow those rules. One of the things that one of the most interesting things about bidding and tendering law is this concept, and I hope this kind of resounds with everyone. And of course, this is subject to the rules of the trade agreements. But when we're developing rules, we don't have to make fair rules. We just have to follow our rules fairly. And this is kind of the broad concept of the flexibility that a well thought out RFP document, open tender document can really provide advantages and flexibility to owners here. So this is kind of one of the first things that we really want to talk about is our project going to be binding or non-binding? If it's going to be binding, here are the rules and here are the flexibilities that we want to have. If it's going to be non-binding, we're going to have to make sure that we're publishing a document that is indeed non-binding and provides us these types of flexibilities as well as these guidelines and being on side with the trade agreements. The next thing that we're going to talk about here is the ill-suited contracts. And this goes to this notion of whether you're talking about compensation model, cost plus, lump sum, or you were talking about our relationship between service provider and owner, design builder, construction manager, general contract. We want to make sure that our contract, our compensation model, our relationship and reliance on our service provider is appropriate for the project and most importantly reflective of the priorities of the project. So one of the best examples I can think of here is we deal with many industrial clients, industrial owner clients, and during shutdown time, we all know that time is of the absolute essence. They shut down their facility for 30 days. If they shut down for 31 days, every day longer is $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, whatever it may be. So time is the absolute necessity, much more than the budget, much more than some of these other items. And so we need to ensure that whatever our contract is, it's creating an alignment of the owner's interests with the contractor's interests and not creating a misalignment to the point that we're so concerned about budget spend that the only relief that the contractor has the ability to get is time. And all of a sudden what we're seeing is we're setting up ourselves for, a 50-day project because budget is so sensitive, but it's only a 30-day window. So it's something to think about, that we want to make sure that our form of contract aligns with our project priorities. The next thing is, as Andrew just finished dealing with his trade agreement compliance, and this is this whole notion to ensure that we are acting and conduct in concurrence with our applicable trade agreements, that we're not acting in a way that's contrary to those that's going to give rise to claims, even if the damage of breach can be fairly modest. What we do want to avoid is, as best as we can, to ensure that we're on side with those trade agreements from a reputational point of view, from a trust point of view, and to ensure that we're conducting the way that we're supposed to. Go to the next one. Perfect. So the next ones all kind of really have to deal with what's going to be the content of our RFP documents. So our first one is this notion of evaluation criteria. So in whether it be binding or non-binding processes, often owners will publish, this is how, in a very express way, how they're going to ultimately determine the winner of the competitive process. So it may be a mathematical formula that is very heavily based on both qualitative and quantitative functions, and there's a scoring at the end. There may be a portion that's subjective, kind of pass-fail, or some sort of relative ranking, and then there's a financial evaluation associated with it. Whatever it is, we want to ensure that if we intend to rely on that formula and rely on that evaluation criteria, that we're publishing it so that there's protections from trade agreements or other types of complaints, that we then follow that formula that we're publishing in a very sincere way. And more strategic than that is the evaluation criteria that we're picking. Let's make sure that it makes perfect sense. Most recently, we've seen a evaluation criteria that was following a very numerical measurement metric, and from an evaluation point of view, they had weighted on let's say a score, a total score of 100. They gave as much weight, let's say 25 points, to a financial item that averaged around 25 grand, to the exact same number of points to a financial item that was worth 3 million. And in that case, it creates a very much a disparity between the relative importance of these items. So we want to make sure that our evaluation criteria actually drives the results that we actually want. And it can be fairly complicated, and it's something that actually requires a lot of deep strategy and deep thought. As well as it allows us to steer to our preferred components if, let's say, we're encountering some bad apples that we know have bad reputations. We can develop evaluation criteria that is not going to be in their favor, so that we're not faced with a low bidder that is someone that we absolutely don't want to work with. So our evaluation criteria can be used to prevent those situations. The next one is a lack of defined scope. So this is something that, whether you're using a cost plus contract or you're using a lump sum contract or whatever, it's always very imperative for the owner to truly have a ring fence as to what the project is going to be, and do as best a job in as timely way to really define the scope of work, define and understand what that contract growth could be, and to make sure that that potential contract growth is still within the funding budgets available to the owner. Again, we have lots of incidental contract growth as a result of, owner design changes or unforeseen conditions or unforeseen ground conditions, or even bad weather, extended winter conditions. These are all things that need to be considered within the budgeting of the process, but also can it really be managed in line with understanding what the scope is going to be, and trying to prevent contract growth before anything else that happens there. And so, this is one of the things that we really suggest that owners are as collaborative as possible with their service providers, their architect, designers, their construction managers, the general contractors, get a really good handle on constructability issues, really get a good handle on potential errors or conflicts in the design as best as they can before they start building. And this is really a notion of claim suppression as well. I'm sure there's a bit of irony for us to talk about overassignment of risk, as often it's the lawyers that are blamed for overassignment of risk in contracts. And really what we're talking about here is your form of contract of which you're putting out to the market basically puts all owner risk. It doesn't matter what it is, time, budget, weather, all of these types of things, and shifting all of that risk down to your contractor, which some owners may think is a great thing, because here we're going to have some price certainty, we're going to have some schedule certainty and things of this nature. However, what it's ultimately going to do is first of all, create a lot of tension between the market and individual proponents and the owner, where there isn't necessarily an alignment of interests. The second thing that it's probably going to do is really blow your budget. And so, we really suggest that owners be very, very strategic as to what risks and how much risk they shift down through their contract. Pick risks based upon who has the best ability to control, who has the best ability to insure, understand the effect of shifting risk on project budgets, and understanding what is marketable. And if we're going to go something that's beyond what's market norm, that's fine, but understand the tensions that it may cause and understand the cost impacts of it, and making these decisions in a very informed way. And that's frankly a much of what Andrew, myself, and our other colleagues that operate in this construction solicitor, construction procurement space do, is really help advise our clients on you know we could shift this risk down, but it's rare to see that. You're going to get an adverse market reaction, and understand these sorts of things. The other good sounding board, and Andrew may scoff and can't believe I'm actually saying this, is our construction association actually probably provides a bit of feedback as to whether certain types of provisions are going to be acceptable to potential market proponents, and really kind of be collaborative with them in kind of what is market norms.
Yeah, and
So I will say, often lawyers carry bad reputation in over prescribing risk, in the sense of get as much risk out of your contract because that's going to be the best thing for you. And that's not necessarily true. I think you have to look at risk from an overall holistic point of view, from a budget point of view, and from market relationship point of view, and really determine the sweet spot as to shedding risk, but you're getting good value for shedding that risk.
yeah, and the other thing I would say
Um,
is, sorry, just to add to that,
yeah, go ahead.
the other thing I would say is, even if you get them to sign on the dotted line to take all the risk, it's not necessarily the end of the story. And if things do go bad,
Yeah.
which I've seen a lot on the dispute side, they're just going to walk away, or you're going to be in a very long dispute resolution process with them, and they're going to say you owe them a bunch of extra money. So all your cost certainty, it might be a mirage of cost certainty, I guess, is in assigning all that risk, is all I would say to that. So
Yeah.
nothing to add beyond.
Yeah, I would say, just as I know we're kind of running low on time, if we could just go back a slide, actually, Andrew.
Sure.
Two kind of interesting tidbits. Sorry, we'll hear. In my past life, when I was working with contractors a lot, looking at the risk of number 5, the lack of defined scope. We were working on a project, and it was a large community center, a pool and rec center in a municipality in BC. And the defined scope was done so poorly at the procurement stage, as well as actually it still wasn't evolved and developed enough at the time of initial construction. This is a project that I'm going to say it was in and around 30 million bucks, and I think by the time it finished, the final budget I think was 70 million. And it had something of the nature of like 3,000 to 4,000 change orders associated with it, and finished 2.5 years late. And this is what we call a nightmare. And so, at that point in time, the project budget is at large, the project schedule is at large, meaning that there's no definitive measure, no ability or accountability. And this all had to do with, a rushed approach, a non-strategic approach, and was an absolute nightmare from an owner point of view, but also from a contractor point of view. And every day there was something that was fluid in that project that really made it difficult for everybody. And so, had things went slower, had things been more collaborative at the outset, that wouldn't have not happened. The other thing, a little tidbit on overassignment of risk. We just recently helped a client who took an overassignment of risk approach prior to engaging us, and that ended up being almost a 6-month negotiation with their successful proponent. They picked the person that they wanted to win, and were so far down the path with them, but they still couldn't actually sign the agreement because there was so much risk being shifted down that there was really no middle ground that was reasonable to either side. And so that's another risk, is you're going to have a really extended negotiation period and a lot of tension throughout that negotiation period, even with the successful proponent. And that's real risk to the project. So if we go one more, perfect. These are just two minor, kind of minor risks. One is the builder's lien holdback, and what we want to understand is that there's clarity as to what part of the project is going to be subject to that builder's lien act, and most importantly, the holdback. We've seen recently, even in Saskatchewan, the engagement of European suppliers, European contractors coming in and doing some industrial work on in the province, and they weren't aware of the holdback, and it really messes with their cash flow models and can really disrupt the financing of the project, where the owner really doesn't have much flexibility to not take that holdback because of the risk of double jeopardy payments. So we want to ensure that there's clarity and alignment between owners' holdback obligations and the contractor and all subcontractor payment expectations. Last, and is incredibly important, especially in this climate, is the timing and manner of compensation. And really what we're talking about here is understanding, so two things. One, how we're going to be making payments to our contractor. Is it going to be done on a progress complete basis, so our typical monthly payment, and they get paid for the progress of the work? If they're 5% done, they're going to get another 5% of the contract price, so on and so forth. Are we going to move more to a milestone-based payment that as soon as they reach this milestone, they're going to get 10%? They make this milestone, they get 20%. And understanding the administrative burden, administrative risks in going with a progress payment versus a milestone payment. It also really matters from an owner funding point of view as to when those funds are going to be available to actually pay out, and ensure that the funding model aligns with our compensation model, so that at no point in time that we're going to be forced to make payments where we don't have funding available yet. The kind of the other side of this is this new prompt pay regime that is coming our way, and understanding the administrative burden and tight timelines associated with that prompt pay and the risks of being offside. And so there's going to be a lot of preparation for all of our owners, public and private, to ensure that they can be compliant with the requirements of that prompt pay regime, and understanding that the administrative certification of those payments, where sometimes owners used to take 20, 30, 40 days to ensure the accuracy and not overpayment, that timeline is so much more reduced now, that we want to ensure that we're having and creating a compensation regime that aligns with that. Andrew, I know we've kind of run out of time here. I guess if you wanted to take it from there.
Yeah, and we've got two slides left, and then we'll take questions. If you can hang on for a couple more minutes, we'll wrap this up quick. And I apologize for going over time, but I hope you're all getting something good out of this. And so we'll keep going. If we lose a few, we lose a few. But without dwelling on about it, we kind of thought about it. What are the key things you need to think about in your contract? And this is really reflective of what we've been talking about all morning, so we don't need to kind of go right back through it. But is your scope of work well defined? What kind of pricing model have you decided on? And thinking about that, what are the consequences of going over budget, and how are you going to evaluate what's 50% done look like if you're invoicing for 50%? Contract time. And just to dwell on this one, what are the consequences of going over time? Robbie talked about a shutdown. That's where there's big consequences. And people talk a lot about liquidated damages for delay, and that's sometimes a very good strategy. Sometimes, not actually misaligns interests. So we just want to flag that there's different ways to kind of make, if the consequence of going over time is significant, you want to align interests. But, do you want to create penalties? Do you want to create incentives? Do you want to collaborate? There's different approaches, and different ones are going to work better in different situations. Another one we didn't, spend a lot of time on, but, change orders and claims. And if you have, poor scopes and, wrongly assigned risk and those kind of things, you're going to see change orders, you're going to see claims. And so how are you going to deal with those? Is your contract going to button them up and limit them? Is it going to, kind of leave it open? Generally we are inclined to, people should be letting you know right away if there's claims so that the owner can make a decision. Do you want to go ahead with this extra work that they're saying is extra? Or do you want to say it's not extra work? Please proceed at the price you gave me. It's better to suss those things out in real time than to find out about them, project's done and all of a sudden you get a bill at the end for kind of the makeup. A couple other things that, we're not going to take a long time on because, they could all be topics in themselves, but, making sure the project is properly insured. There's different models where, owner might take on taking over the insurance and making sure it's all lined up. Contractor might take it on. Understanding how they work together, and particularly where there's existing infrastructure that might be covered under different policies. Say you're doing a renovation and the existing building's covered and the new building, how you deal with that, very important to talk to your insurance professionals and, legal professionals to make sure that's lined up. Limits of liability and indemnity, pretty contentious with contractors, but, understand, if something goes wrong, what's the limit of how much you can get back to compensate you for what went wrong. Dispute resolution, there's litigation, there's arbitration. Don't want to disentangle it, but it's important to understand, what are the steps in dispute resolution if things go wrong? Are there kind of early off ramps to try to resolve things, or do you just kind of go to court? Usually there's different options and different contracts deal with it in different ways. And then the last thing is quality. And what are the quality requirements? And one thing we always see is, if you have seen this on a project that had 6,000 deficiencies, and looming over the contractor was liquidated damages in the millions of dollars. And so they wanted to be on time and finish on time so that they didn't have to pay those liquidated damages. So what happened? Corners were cut. There was a lot of deficiencies, and it took months, years to kind of clean up. So, excuse me. Excuse me. But that's kind of a key thing, is aligning things properly to kind of make sure that you're not incentivizing poor quality. Oh, I apologize.
Sure. So maybe I'll take it from here and kind of address. There was a couple questions that came in, and we can address some of those. First question, which is a great question, is first of all, can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm just getting some feedback. Okay, so first question that I saw was, can you comment on what would happen if the work from a low price tender was not awarded to the lowest compliant bidder? The second or third lowest bidder is awarded the work. So it's a great question. And so the consequences of it, first of all, I'm going to give the most lawyer answer that every lawyer will always say is it depends. And there's a lot of pending factors to it. So the first has to do with, was it a binding or non-binding process? So if it's a binding process, an official tender, and the rules of the tender really determined that the lowest compliant bidder will be the successful proponent, then the owner that does not award to that lowest compliant bidder is potentially at risk of a claim, with the damages of the claim being the entirety of the profit that lowest compliant bidder would have made on the project. Now, if it's a non-binding, if it's a non-binding process and there's some flexibility to allow for some awards based upon qualitative assertion, some flexibility in negotiations, some flexibility in how we award, and we don't necessarily have to award to the lowest bidder, the lowest compliant bidder, and we have what's called a discretionary clause, then we can potentially avoid any type of consequence there, subject to what's in the trade agreements. And so What we may be looking at in this situation is, even if it's a non-binding tender and the awards of or the rules of the tender allow this type of flexibility, you still may be subject to a claim under that trade agreement, which has a variety of different penalties, but at most, the highest penalty applicable there under is that $50,000 charge that Andrew referenced earlier. Andrew, do you have any further comments on that?
Claim for lost profits. And so just think about it, that your project budget is the profit, is 100% plus the profit, maybe 20% of the price, to someone who's not going to do the work and has zero risk of losing. They don't have a performance risk that, they might not make the full 20% if, some things don't go to plan for their reasons. So big risk if you're in a binding process. There's advantages to a binding tender process, but this is the big disadvantage and the big risk.
Yeah, and I'd say, if this is something that, owners are very concerned about, that they don't necessarily always want to go with the lowest price, the best way to steer this is try to create a process that provides as much flexibility in its qualification evaluation, and so that there is some subjective elements to it, some flexibility within it, as well as a determinative, qualitative aspect that makes that award subject beyond just the price. And we see that a lot now in public sector evaluations and RFPs, that they're giving qualification considerations. So strength of project team, past experience of like projects, past experience with that, that RM, that city, that province. And was there a history of claims? Was there a history of confrontation and budget being blown, and things of this nature? And so, we can create enough strategy there that we're not handcuffed to go with the lowest bidder, and we don't want to work with them, but here they are, $10 cheaper than the next, and now we're stuck. And so that's a lot of strategy. And I think that actually goes well with our next question is, are there professionals that can be hired to write a procurement and advise on the style should be used and the associated cost with it? So Andrew may wrap me out to BD on this one, but truthfully, there is a wide variety of people that assist with this. Lawyers can do this, and lawyers do this often. Am I grinning when I say I think we're the best at it? Yes, but project management consultants, so the Colliers of the world and those types of owner representation project managers often assist with this. Your design consultants, your architect consultants, they often assist with this. And there's even some independent project manager consultants, or even the big public accounting firm consultants that hold their hat out to advise on this. To speak candid, each one of these different consultants, different third-party service providers, have different skill sets, have different experience, have different perspectives, and it's all about finding one that you have trust in, you have confidence in, you feel comfortable with their approach, their logic that they're taking. We all give, the best advice that we think that's best for our client, and we kind of approach it that way. And it just kind of depends on that. From a price point of view, I think, there isn't a massive price difference between any one of these service providers. It's just a matter of probably, again, the experience, the outcome that you're looking for, the risks that you're trying to manage. And to approach it that way. Andrew, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, and I would just quickly say this. I see Dustin's come on, maybe to play the exit music for us, but the only thing I would say on this is, often, everyone brings their own thing, and I actually like working together with other professionals who bring different points of view from, say, a project management perspective or a design perspective. Because, Robbie and I, we know a lot about the law of competitive bidding and those kind of things. We don't know a lot about, like, we're not engineers and we don't try to be. And so we're not, we can kind of tell if a scope is unclear or clear, but we can't tell you what to put there. That's not really our domain. And so, we see more and more kind of integrated teams is the way to go. The one thing I would say is, getting people at the front end before documents are on the street is probably the biggest thing you can do, whether people are just reviewing to provide comments or doing it themselves. That's kind of a key takeaway. So I know that we're probably running out of time here, and I think, we had most people kind of stay, and, thank you for hearing our presentation. The last thing I'll say, and that if you download the presentation, you can see our contact info. We're also, both of us are, to the extent people use LinkedIn, we're on there and kind of sometimes post thoughts on these types of topics. But yeah, you can give us a call, talk to us. I'd even like to know how you think we did. So, get our email and shoot us an email and tell us how we did. Would love to hear from all of you.
Well, I want to thank you, Andrew and Robbie. There was tons of great stuff in your presentation and a lot of really helpful takeaways for everybody on the call. Procurement's a hard thing, and it's complex, and you've helped us to kind of navigate through some of the really big pieces that we need to be considering. So again, thank you, and thanks also to those who submitted questions. I think they got to them all, but if there are any that didn't get addressed, by all means, we'll follow up with those questions later. The presentation will be available for download, and you'll be able to maybe go back over some of those pieces of the presentation that you find particularly helpful, or maybe that will be instructive for you as you're doing your own procurements. Lastly, if you've got questions, of course, reach out to Andrew or Robbie. Also, feel free to reach out to SARM staff too. So our trading services area does provide some advice and support for RFPs and tendering. We would at least be willing to help connect you with those who will be able to give you some of that care and instruction that you may need. And so that concludes our tendering and procurement best practices educational session for our midterm convention. SARM wishes you a safe and healthy rest of your week, and hope that you don't have to drive on the roads today. So with that, we'll conclude. Thanks so much.